Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this installment, I wanted to talk about 5 typical mistakes that are made by Behringer X32 and Midas M32 users and how to avoid them. I did a similar video for the XR18, but I wanted to do one dedicated to the X32 and the M32, and I wanted to go a lot more in depth on this one. In mixing, regardless of the console, gain staging and signal flow are important concepts, so a lot of what we'll go over here will ultimately tie into those concepts. At the end of this video, I'll have one specific example of why this is important. It's an example of one major pitfall of a commonly made mistake, and I want to show you what will happen if you make this mistake. But before we get to that, we'll start here. And in reality, these first two fit neatly together in the puzzle that begins your sound check. So without any further ado, the number 5 mistake made by Behringer X32 users is improper gain settings. People mistakenly believe they need to bring the gain up to 0 on the channels of an X32 or an M32. Or they don't really know what they should be set at all and think it's arbitrary. Channel gain should be set to show -18 dBFS on the channel meters. These meters are at a different scale than an analog console. These are dBFS, dB full scale. Therefore, at soundcheck, you want to adjust your gain so that your input meter is hitting -18 dBFS, or at least thereabouts. This is important to keep your gain staging starting correctly from the beginning and consistently across the board. Establishing this baseline setting keeps your signal flow consistent after the gain control, from one step in the channel to the next, and consistent channel to channel, show to show, and even band to band. The gain is essentially the first step your signal from the stage will hit in the console that you have any control over. There is some margin of error here, so don't think you have to be 100% perfect with that -18 dBFS level on the meter. Invariably, eventually someone will sandbag you at some point and not give you performance levels at soundcheck, no matter how much they claim they are playing or singing at the volume they'll be at when the show starts. But in most cases, that'll be fine. You can deal with it with the fader if it happens. A little more fader, a little less fader, that's fine. Whatever it takes to get the mix you need out front. We've been focusing on the channel meter, but there is another way to meter your input. You can solo a channel via the solo button on each channel. With the board's default settings, this will send just that soloed channel to your headphones where you can listen to the channel if you want, and it will send the signal to the solo meter on the board screen as shown here. This meter has more resolution than the individual channel meters or the meter in the gain section itself, so it gives you a little more accurate look at the signal for setting the gain. I should mention, it's a good habit to go ahead and turn off any channel compression, channel gates, or channel EQ before you start setting the gains. You can go ahead and engage those later in the process, and we're going to talk more about EQ here in one of the further steps. Ultimately, our goal here is set the gain properly at the sound check and then let the gain be set and forget. And tying into all of this is mistake number 4. Improper use of sends and faders at soundcheck. As a rule, the first thing you should do to start a soundcheck, or really as soon as you power up the console, is mute all of the channels. At least mute the channels that you're using, the channels that have something connected to them. Or just play it safe and mute all the channels. And for the most part, people do this part right. Then they start the soundcheck or line check, and they set the gain, hopefully like we just mentioned, and then they make the mistake. That mistake is they simply unmute the channel, leaving the channel fader and monitor sends wherever they were left from the last show. This is an invitation for trouble. If there's any noise in any of the lines, in any of the channels, as soon as the channel is unmuted, it'll be in the system for all to hear. Or maybe the levels are even hot enough that unmuting the channel sends you a blast of feedback. Not only is feedback painful, but it can be damaging for speakers. It's even possible someone is on stage saying something private, and when you just unmute the mic at volume, well, it's not so private anymore. So, the thing to do is to select your channel, make sure it's muted, the fader down, the monitor sends turned down as well, then have someone sing or play, and you set the gain control on the channel as we talked about in the first section. Now, while we're on the subject of faders and the gain control, I want to mention something that some people will recommend as a way to set your gain. It's actually something that's left over from 50 years ago, literally, at a time when consoles didn't have much metering and everything was a hodgepodge, so consistency wasn't really all that possible. What they'll tell you to do is to bring the channel fader up to unity and then adjust the gain knob to get the level in the house that you want to hear. And that's simply not a good method. There's a reason the console has metering, and there's a reason it has faders. I can assure you, the faders aren't there to be set at unity and just to be left alone. So, if someone tries to give you this type of advice, it may be well-meaning, but it's out of date. So, you know not to do that now. We've discussed the proper way to set gain, that the gain should be minus 18 dBFS on the scale. Your faders and sends should be down. So with the gain set, now you're ready to hear your channel. You can now unmute the channel and bring the fader up slowly to listen to your signal in the house. You can also now re-engage your channel EQ so you can hear and set your EQ in the house. Depending on your desired workflow or what the band wants, you can now give the musicians their desired monitor levels for that channel as well. Or you can finish the line checks for everything and then do the monitors in a second pass. And now that we're talking about EQ and following our signal flow chain, that brings us to mistake number 3. Not utilizing the high pass filter in the EQ section. Behringer calls this low cut. Either term means the same thing. The high pass filter, or low cut, is a slope, not a cliff. It will roll lows off at a slope, not cut them off abruptly. If nothing else, you should at least engage the low cut filter at 20 Hz. That will reduce subsonic material that is below the usable range from getting to your amps and wasting headroom. It should also make your speakers a little less susceptible to overexcursion. In general live music settings, there's really no downside to using a 20 Hz low cut filter on every channel. But that said, it's pretty likely 20 Hz can be moved up to 30 Hz or even 40 Hz, especially if you don't have a wall of subs and several thousand watts of power on the subs. And if your system's not even using subs, then definitely go with 40 Hz, if not even a higher cutoff. If you don't understand the concept of high-pass filters at all, then at least engage them on every channel and set them at 20 Hz. If you want to experiment and learn, then move them up to 30 Hz and even 40 Hz to see if you notice a negative difference on any channels like your kick and your bass guitar. And like I said, if you don't have a wall of subs and thousands of watts on those subs, you're likely going to be fine with a 40 Hz low-cut filter. That setting is going to be just that much better for headroom in the amps and helping with any potential speaker overexcursion issues. If we take the concept of high-pass filters a little deeper and be a little more surgical, we can dial them in more via the source. That would be the ideal way. Instruments like the kick drum, the deeper drums like the floor toms, the bass guitar, keyboards, synthesizers, all of those are instruments that I would expect to use a 20 to 40 Hz setting for the high-pass filter. Those are all instruments with deep lows. But sources with less low-end energy, like guitars, snare drum, higher toms, and vocals, are going to benefit with something like a 100 Hz setting for the high-pass filter. That will clear some of the mud and low-end stage wash from those channels. It's important to note what I said earlier. The low-cut or high-pass filter is a slope and not a cliff. Lows don't just disappear below that cutoff frequency. They just gently roll off. Don't assume everything below the cutoff frequency is just gone. It doesn't work like that. You should always have a bit of an EQ strategy, and any EQ strategy should start with the use of the high-pass filter. And now that we're talking even more about EQ, that brings us to mistake number 2 that Behringer X32 users make. Over-EQing. It's hard to tell you exactly what the right EQ should look like for your sources, but it's generally pretty easy to recognize over-EQing. Generally speaking, for any type of pop, rock, or modern country, drums will be where you might expect the most aggressive use of EQ. Even then, just to a point. Guitars, keys, vocals, those can usually work well with just a minimal EQ, especially when you start with the proper use of a high-pass filter as your first step. Let's take a look at a typical vocal EQ. I would expect to see a vocal EQ look something like this. When you're EQing a vocal, maybe you hear a little woolliness in the vocal. If so, you should look to cut that first, not try to boost to minimize it. So that woolliness is typically something in the low mids, so you would want to find that low mid area and cut that some. Listen closely as you make each change and try and make sure it did what you wanted. Don't just keep digging the hole deeper. Maybe after removing that woolliness, you now hear a little bit of a sharpness to the vocal. Typically that would be in the high mids, so go ahead and reduce that area a little bit as well. And maybe after you fix that problem, you notice that the voice is lacking just a little bit of a shimmer, a little high end. So go ahead and add a little bit of high end, and in this case a high end shelving EQ works really well there. Sometimes it could be that maybe only one of those things is the only thing you really needed to do. And instead of that high mid cut, maybe you needed to add a little bit of high mid to make the vocals stand out above, say, the other instruments. Generally, we're only talking about a few dB of difference and only at a few points. A lot of times, something like a synthesizer won't really need any EQ at all, or at least it can certainly be fine without it. In most cases, a little EQ goes a long way. So if your EQ typically looks anything like these examples, it's a good bet you're over EQing. Always try to EQ with a strategy of cutting first and boosting only secondarily. And try and use a minimalist approach. A little goes a long way, and listen to each step as you do it. Boosting especially should be limited. I did mention the drums being somewhere that in modern music can be a little more aggressively EQ'd. Let's go ahead and call up the kick drum channel in this scene and just take a quick look at it. You can see the high pass filters being used. There's a low end boost for some bottom end on the kick, and there's a low mid cut to take out some of the woolliness and open up the sound of the kick more, making it less muddy. And then there's a couple of upper mid boosts. Those upper mid range boosts we see would be to emphasize the beater. Emphasizing the beater lets us hear the attack of the kick drum so it's not just a dull thud. Doing that aggressively will make for a clicky kick drum, and if that's what you want, that's how to get it. That said, make sure the genre you're mixing actually calls for that. And this brings us to the number one worst mistake a Behringer X32, Midas M32, or really the user of any console can make, and that is mixing on the gain knobs. Don't mix on the gain knobs. Gain knobs should be set and forget. You have sends and you have faders to adjust the mix and the monitor levels. We're back to discussing signal flow, and with the gain knob being essentially the first step, any changes you make to the gain will impact everything else down the line. Once the show is going, some of these impacts might not be as obvious as others, or you might put the blame for the symptoms on the wrong things. When we talked about gain settings earlier, I mentioned there is a margin of error, lower or higher. If you did get sandbagged during soundcheck and now during the show someone is hitting harder than minus 18 dBFS consistently, unless they are suddenly redlining or threatening to, just live with it at this point. You can bring the fader down to compensate in the house, and you can bring the monitor sends down on the channel if anyone is complaining on stage. If it's the opposite problem and they're not even getting to minus 18 dBFS on the meter, just run the fader a few steps higher than normal to compensate. If you were to readjust the gain now, you're effectively changing the threshold settings on things like gates and compressors that follow in the signal path on that channel, and you're changing things like your FX sends on that channel. But here is the biggie. You're not only changing these things in the house levels when you adjust the gain control, you're changing the monitor levels on that channel when you change the gain control, because they come after the gain control. This is the example I mentioned at the start of the video that I wanted to show you. These meters coming up here are showing you the output levels for outputs 1 through 4, which are mixes 1 through 4 on our monitors. Watch what happens to those levels as I adjust the gain on the vocal channel. They go up and down with each movement of the gain knob. Even a small amount of adjustment on the gain knob can make a drastic difference. That's not just a meter issue, that is the monitors on stage getting louder and quieter. Not only are you changing the monitor levels that the musicians on stage are hearing, but if you're taking the gain up, you could be getting those monitors closer to feedback. Feedback doesn't care what knob you turn up to make a source louder. When it gets loud enough, it will feed back. If you've ever had a band in a club or your church or other setting telling you that the monitor levels keep changing and you've argued you weren't touching their monitors, well, if you were adjusting the gains while they were performing, then actually you were changing their monitor levels. Or at least you were if your monitors were coming from front of house. So all of these things tie together, and you can see why it's important to at least have a basic understanding of signal flow and how changes in one place can cause changes downstream that you might not even think about. It's all interconnected. And that is it for this episode. Please like and subscribe. I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you next time.